étonnante des maladies, la Kuru. On ne la retrouve nulle part dans le monde qu'en Papouasie-Nouvelle-Guinée. Mais pour comprendre cette maladie mystérieuse et neurodégénérative, Michael Helpers, un savant américain, et Carlton Gadgesek découvrent le nouveau pathogène du siècle, transmis lorsque les membres d'une famille en deuil mangent le cerveau d'un être cher. Logiquement, cette maladie est étroitement liée au cannibalisme. Kuru, de Science and Sorcery, c'est un film réalisé par Rob Bygott, une production Siamese Production et SBS, qui a remporté le prix spécial du jury du FIFO 2011 sur Polynésie Première.
Australian scientist Professor Michael Helpers has dedicated over 50 years researching Kuru, an incurable brain disease unique to Papua New Guinea.
Kuru was a new disease that was killing lots of people and was a complete mystery.
But this obscure disease, found deep within these jungles, holds the key to unlocking vital information for understanding two of the world's most frightening diseases, mad cow disease and its human form, variant CJD.
Quite clearly now the outbreak of variant CJD is very closely entwined with Kuru. And although now we're looking at the tip of the first iceberg in Europe, what we're learning from out here is there's much more to come.
It's a medical detective story that unearths cannibalism. And a world of sorcery. And one that is far from over.
And who could believe that 50 or more years after Kuru investigation started, we'd still be looking for cases?
It was in Adelaide in 1957 when Michael Helpers, then a young medical student, first heard about Kuru.
I read about Kuru in the Adelaide Advertiser, and they called it the Laughing Death. But reading into the article a bit more, they indicated this was an important neurological disease. Instead of going to 2 o'clock lectures, I'd go to the library. And I had all these notes that I made, and I had to write down all the literature and little summaries and so forth. So I was really quite obsessed by this.
When Michael was at medical school in the 1950s, Papua New Guinea was an Australian territory, and patrol officers had only recently ventured into its uncharted regions. There, they encountered a totally alien world of Stone Age cultures, cannibalism, sorcery, and tribal conflict. Reports started to emerge of a mysterious brain disorder affecting only the Foray people of the Eastern Highlands. Its victims described as trembling, laughing, and falling over.
The first reports about Kuru in the general literature came from anthropologists describing Kuru as a psychosomatic disease. Some kind of reaction to the change in their world with the advent of the Australian administration.
Tragically, Kuru seemed to be concentrated amongst the women and the children.
Pinba taimi bintiba bigo kampayo kwamara watayi marama ya kupagrama apia kariara ga shubindi kariamba shubindi waya pinti wala wama ya sipo tayo baba gibo
wawe ya gwamje ba waya pela shubimi mje makami ya igoma ba ai kupinje kimenya ibya bije kudu na rwoma bakiwa njamba binti garu.
There are 200 dying every year throughout the whole Kuru region. But it was a little hard to believe that the young children were getting this psychosomatic disease and they were all dying from it. It didn't seem to make any sense at all.
But what was even more puzzling was that Kuru was only affecting the Foray people, at the time only 20,000 of a total population of 1.7 million on the whole island of New Guinea.
It was confined to this very remote area. Why, we don't know. An infection would come to mind first. There was a possibility that it was genetic, but there were so many other possibilities.
In 1961, Michael seized the opportunity to become the first Australian medical officer to be sent into the Kuru region.
When it was discovered that I was going to work on Kuru, all my teachers said, why waste your time doing that? And this was serious. It wasn't in anybody's mindset as the proper career path for a doctor.
3 years after first hearing about Kuru, Michael abandoned a conventional career in medicine and arrived instead with his young family at a colonial outpost in the North Foray area.
The general expectation before I left was that I was going to a wild and dangerous place and that the natives were dangerous people.
Papua New Guinea magina mape sheki mai binti kana mape kuto mana ma dia ba nda pa dia kima kasi manaka pimana dia mata ara pota mama tarana tue nage masin manda mo kana masin pia uto paganisi kiena wape ma kokore ma yaga bai huwa sime minji yo
Awajibi ya tabe mapumaka tabeambi.
There was a real connection with the traditional past. It was something quite different from anything I'd experienced before, and I found it exotic.
Michael decided to leave the security of the colonial outpost to live in Waisa, a small village at the very center of the epidemic.
I wanted to work in a community, follow patients from beginning to end of their clinical course, and I wanted to photograph them. Kuru was just something I knew about from reading, and it was something in my head, but I had no experience of it.
Michael began to track the full effects of the disease, filming and observing patients from the first symptoms of Kuru, with headaches and pains, through to their final agonizing stages, trapped inside their bodies, barely able to move or communicate.
We didn't know whether it was going to continue to expand. I mean, the whole community might come down with Kuru. I mean, it was unknown for me and unknown for the people experiencing this.
Nanunemba Kuru Buritagina, Naranto Kuru Buritagina, to Naranto Kuru Buritagina, Wayande Kurumba Burite. Tiavikivikana. Fugomoto, Yena Vikivi, Manda Vinda Kikivi, Anungayambuena Vikivi, Kagayena Vikivi, Anavia Vikivinga Yenaba. Pipatawaki, Magina, Guasuama, Mayama Miyagana.
There were a lot of diseases that were killing people. People accepted the fact that children were more likely to die, perhaps, than to live. This is the general tenor of life in a traditional community, but there was this additional fear about Kuru. and in particular about Kuru sorcery.
Sorcerers were feared members of Papua New Guinea society, and sorcery is the local explanation for the cause of Kuru, a belief that remains even today. To try and understand more about sorcery in the foray, Michael turned to anthropologist Shirley Lindenbaum, working in a nearby village.
People talked about sorcery all the time. Any outsiders who walked through the village were watched in case they picked up little particles of people's food or hair clippings. So sorcery was an obsession.
To the people of Papua New Guinea, sorcery is likened to a form of murder, and justice was commonly sought through revenge killings. These were the second highest cause of death after Kuru amongst the foray.
This was a shifting boundary between friends and enemies. And why would anyone be so evil as to kill members of your family, your daughter, your wife? This was a tragedy in this community.
Michael knew that he was dealing with a totally new type of disease, and after 3 months in the field, he was no closer to solving the puzzle that was Kuru. Then he met American virologist Carlton Gajusek, the only other medical researcher dedicated to trying to understand this strange disease.
It didn't take very long to realize that we were both on the same wavelength in terms of our attitude to the world and where we thought what we were doing would fit in. And I had great respect for Carlton because of all the work that he'd already done.
It was Carlton's early pioneering work that had identified Kuru as affecting only the foray. But more importantly, he had also established that it was a totally new disease of the brain.
Kuru is a new disease, and that doesn't happen very often, and Carlton recognised that this was extremely important, and this was something that had to be investigated. It was an opportunity to learn, and it might provide information not only that would help the people that were dying of this disease, but to give us understanding about neurological diseases in general. I mean, he understood that right from the beginning.
Carlton had done every medical test known to science, in particular investigating the prime suspect, cannibalism.
Everybody's been thinking cannibalism, everybody I met, before I saw Kuru. But we found that that couldn't be the case. We had no inflammation, all the medical reasons for not, and we threw it out.
Cannibalism had to be dismissed when every one of Carlton's tests on animals demonstrated that Kuru was neither infectious nor transmissible.
We inoculated everything from snakes to bears. And we had watched them for 1, 2, 3, 4, 6 months. 0. This was something new. I didn't know anything about what it was, but it was certainly new.
After 5 years of investigations, every avenue of human medical research had been exhausted to try and understand the cause of this strange disease and how it was spreading. To the scientists, Kuru was a complete and utter mystery. And in 1962, When Michael teamed with Carlton to solve this puzzle, their commitment to help the foray left them with no choice but to explore other models of science.
We were forced to look beyond human disease, and then we were given a vital clue from veterinary sources. It was a neurodegenerative disease of sheep that had been known for 200 years or more, which the French called the trembling disease, and the English, scrapie.
Few medical scientists had even heard of scrapie, as no human brain disease had ever been linked to an animal disease before. But for Michael and Carlton, the evidence was compelling.
The similarity of these two diseases was uncanny, and the most striking thing, when you look at them under the microscope, were the holes in the brain cells and this spongy-like effect with thousands of tiny holes throughout the brain.
But what was of more interest was that scrapie had been proven by veterinarians to be transmissible, with unheard-of incubation periods.
It was transmissible from sheep to sheep, but the incubation period on these transmission experiments was measured in years, and that was extraordinary, never been described in any infectious disease before. So this was significant, and of course the implication of this was that Kuru itself might be infectious, it might be transmissible.
No human disease had ever taken more than a few weeks for infection to surface, and more significantly, no degenerative brain disease had ever been shown to be transmissible between humans.
And if we were able to show that Kuru was transmissible, this would open up a new field in human medicine. There was no question about that. People would have to take notice.
But first, Michael and Carlton had to embark on something no scientist had ever attempted.
This meant that we had to do transmission experiments with the expectation of incredibly long incubation periods.
So they planned an experiment that could take up to 10 years.
Irrespective of anything else, one had to test whether this disease, Kuru, was transmissible to primates.
And there was only one way they felt they could do this, by using chimpanzees, the closest primates to humans. The plan? To inject them with brain tissue taken from a Kuru victim straight after death.
We were going to go beyond what anybody might have expected. We were going into an unknown. But it was clear that that's what had to be done.
Michael then set about finding a suitable patient for the autopsy.
I knew Kigea as a young girl in the village. The rumour was that she had Kuru, so I went to see her, and she would have been a little bit unsteady on her feet. In this context, here, where Kuru is the dominant disease, you know what the outcome is. Even an 11-year-old will know that she's got this disease and she's going to die.
Michael meets with Kigea's family to seek permission to perform the autopsy.
They used to cut up the bodies all the time, and everyone was familiar with the parts of the body. So it wasn't a mystery to do an autopsy. But obviously, for me to do it, it was another matter.
The family agrees, and over the next 6 months, Michael observes and records the deterioration of Kigea as Kuru begins to take its course.
She couldn't talk, but she could indicate whether she was feeling okay or whatever. I mean, in this locked-in state, as it were, and knowing she was dying, it's a very, very awful situation to be in, and to watch it, to be part of it, was emotionally very draining.
Abana bubita naziwe. Abana wana biap abana beko bebe. Bubita man tiari mumite buburabe.
Tender, loving care was very important, not only psychologically but also physically. It was wonderful to go and see her, but also very distressing. So it was she was a wonderful young girl. I'll never forget her.
A call goes out from the small hamlet. Kagea has finally died. Within half an hour, Michael arrives at the house.
There was grieving, shouting, wailing, and all the wailing and crying sort of didn't help really in professional activity of doing a good autopsy, but I shut that out. I couldn't look at Kagea's features. She was a head. I had to get the skull off, had to get the brain out, and we had to go quickly. And we did that. There was no turning back.
Turuvo tatu e ona mo puanda kina me. Turuvo tatu ona ba. Mata kayo gia tatipa. Minu bagi vuatai. Mo gilisamenti ya mo anu kia na bunda ta aoina. Mo gilisa sama gina mo kando ba pini mo gangita magina. Pika ita te gina ba. Ai te wani goma kaba. Ayambu na mo pa me mo iga to pata ma me abo tanda kam. Pigo me mo iga to pata ma pigo mo awari ba mata mama. Pigo no pagunitus.
Then we gave everybody a hug and we left with the samples.
Michael leaves the foray for Washington, D.C., where Carlton has organized a facility for the transmission experiment. Here, the samples of Kuru are injected into the brains of two chimpanzees, Daisy and Georgette.
For me, it was a real sense of ambivalence about the fact that we had inoculated these animals. But from our point of view, thinking about all the suffering that had gone on with the Kuru patients, we had a firm responsibility to do this experiment and to do it right. And to do that, from our perspective, we had to have chimpanzees. We couldn't assume a positive outcome, but the implications of positive transmission were immense.
If the chimps contract Kuru, Michael and Carlton will have unearthed an entirely new category of human disease. But even if the experiment is successful, they will still have no idea why Kuru was affecting only the foray people. So Michael now focused on epidemiological research, looking for clues about how Kuru might be spreading, sifting through his field notes, and crucially, earlier annual census records.
The reports that the patrol officers got on their census were pretty accurate, and they would collect information on who had died and whether they died of Kuru and who had started Kuru since the last census. So they had information on the mortality from Kuru, the prevalence of Kuru, and incidents, the new cases that had arisen since the last census. And also, of course, they had the sex, age and name of these people.
This proved to be crucial information. For the first time, Michael had collated 7 years of records and was able to compare the data. What he found was startling.
I remember coming into the lab and then suddenly it sprung out at me. My goodness, this is a major change. The disease seemed to have disappeared in the very young patients.
It was 1964 when Michael got his breakthrough in solving the puzzle of Kuru. He had discovered that no child born after 1960 had come down with Kuru. But the question was, why?
The implication of this change was that the mode of transmission probably had stopped, and those born since then were growing up free of the disease. Now, of all the changes that took place at this time, we had to try and determine which was the most significant or the most relevant to Kuru.
New laws under the Australian administration saw the eradication of many social and cultural practices throughout the territory.
The people had been told that they had to stop fighting, they had to build roads, stop child marriage, and they had to plant coffee. And they did all these things.
The foray had been forced to undergo many changes, but there was one that stood out.
Mata turu aruturu ambavo tatina wasana anu magina. Kia femba kunitagine vigo turu aruturu ngoma wa kumba kine vano. Avugano.
Kako jero ba titigine pa wana tigine ro yebi maruna tigine. Tato mo vigo namba ambavo tatigile ba anu kazi jero zena sepa bite.
The foray had stopped their consumption of human meat by 1959, so cannibalism, previously dismissed because of Carlton's earlier experiments, was now back as a suspect.
If Kuru was transmissible, then the most likely to be the transmitting mode of Kuru was the mortuary practice, consumption of the dead during the mortuary feasts. These had been essentially religious practices, helping to free the spirit of the dead. The mortuary practices had been very important, had been universal, and had been stopped.
The mortuary feasts were part of the foray's customary funeral rites, and it was only the close relatives of the deceased that ate the body.
Amanine, motimo pirua ema, amanikina ma. Agoma yaga agabikena nagina agabikena ma wasana agabikena ba wamani kana ba gosabe utakamanta kina
pu ogaleba bigo marama to bigo kube para ma bigo nane gipuma tawi mamara tegina ba ya biwo binti yoga binti gali sindaga binti ya magabolu musulu pita
zigi kare yo ma paga gumba mati muta mata ma amidurape agara ma yakubu tamba mbiri pura mumana na vitai.
The further Michael investigated the foray's mortuary practices, the clearer it became to him why Kuru was affecting mostly the women and children.
That it was the women and children who were the ones that consumed the dead body and not the men.
Anara no bepindi be anagara ge nena vitas uma atiambi wa pe ya parura pa nena vitai
Atuli
ya wa pa nena vitai
beba wa maba ka kinando manaki kamba wa basukwa manaki magama kinema gama vikena mo ideba ka pakivika.
The argument that cannibalism was the cause of the spread of Kuru was compelling, but proof would depend on the outcome of the transmission experiment. As it happened, Michael and Carlton didn't have to wait 10 years for their answer. 2 years after being injected with infected brain tissue, the chimpanzees developed Kuru.
Daisy was walking around, falling over, looking just as if she was a Kuru patient. And this bold Carlton over, he couldn't believe it. It was uncanny how similar Daisy was. This was a defining moment. We knew that the transmission of Kuru to chimpanzees had been positive, that these animals did have Kuru.
The significance of this outcome couldn't be overstated. They had discovered a totally new type of human disease. It was the first time a human degenerative brain disease had been shown to be transmissible. And what's more, it had the longest incubation period of any human disease known to science. Carlton's earlier experiments simply hadn't been followed for long enough.
This was the outcome of our hopes and dreams, but somehow we'd never thought it would happen, and it had happened.
In February 1966, Michael and Carlton's groundbreaking discovery is published to the world.
I included the names of the chimpanzees and also the names of who provided the inoculum. That would be considered very unusual today, but for me it was a mark of honor.
With transmission established, there was now no doubt in Michael's mind that cannibalism was the cause of the spread of Kuru.
It suddenly became very clear that we now had the fact of transmission. We knew this was infectious. It wasn't simply a hypothesis, it was a fact. It's like the jigsaw puzzle. All the pieces fitted in, and it explained things that you hadn't expected it to explain.
Because it was only close relatives who consumed the dead Kuru victims, this explained why the disease never spread beyond the Foray region. But what still remained a mystery for Michael was how Kuru started in the first place. To help answer this question, he looked once again to anthropologist Shirley Lindenbaum.
It was thought when we first went there that because they were not literate people, they didn't have historical memory. But there are many ways of placing the particular moment in the history of Papua New Guinea. They can date things by the year they were married, the year a child was born, in sort of 5-year batches. So we did a kind of a trek, getting history of first cases stories, and just followed it wherever it took us. It's sort of a historical epidemiology. We just followed a path, and it took us to a point just outside Foray territory in the Kamano and the Kiagana area.
Shirley traced Kuru back to just one case around the beginning of the 1900s. But if this single case was the origin of the Kuru epidemic, then how did it appear in the middle of New Guinea, seemingly from nowhere?
Where did it come from? We had no idea, and nobody could explain that. There are all kinds of attempts to explain it. So we postulated that it began spontaneously in an individual.
The only suspect to fit this profile was a rare disease that occurred throughout the world, called Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, or CJD. And for Michael, the symptoms appeared all too familiar.
The characteristics of it were so clearly like Kuru. And we knew that Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease appeared spontaneously in every human population at about 1 per million per annum, but had been completely ignored by scientists. It was so rare.
With only 20 cases ever reported since its discovery 40 years earlier, the scientific community had never really paid much attention to the disease. But Michael and Carlton decided to go out on a limb, attempting to see if this rare disease could also be transmissible.
We were on our own, very much. There was really nobody else at that stage who wouldn't even dream of trying to see if Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease was transmissible.
So they repeated the Kuru transmission experiment, this time with CJD. And after 18 months, to the surprise of the science community, the chimpanzees contracted the disease. And for Michael, the conclusion was now obvious.
The two diseases, Kuru and Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, were of the same kind. The most logical explanation was that Kuru began in the same way as Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. And one individual came down with a spontaneous change in their brain and became, sadly, in that community, the origin of this terrible and vast epidemic. Transmission of Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease was a very exciting outcome because this clearly indicated that our belief that Kuru would open up a new area of human medicine was justified.
Michael and Carlton had now linked 3 transmissible diseases. Their chain of discoveries was setting a new course for human medicine, and they now gained the recognition from the world's scientific community.
These are very exciting times. I mean, intellectually very exciting. You know, we'd achieved a lot, and it was clear that this probably meant a Nobel Prize.
The rewards are bigger for medicine than they are for anthropology. There was always the odor or the smell or the promise of a Nobel Prize in Kuru.
When Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease was transmitted, Carlton changed somewhat because I think he knew that there was a Nobel Prize. More and more he was spending time giving lectures, going around, making sure that everyone got the message about what had been achieved.
With his eye on a Nobel Prize, Carlton then concentrated on trying to identify the culprit. The agent causing these diseases was unlike any virus or bacteria known to science.
It had very weird properties. Those properties continued to be more and more weird as it was investigated.
Carlton's team discovered that the particle causing the disease was 1,000 times smaller than any other known infecting agent, and found only in the brain and spinal cord. But exactly how it caused the infection was still a complete mystery.
But I couldn't find an antibody, and we still can't. So everything about it is unique. The rule is still today that every infection on Earth produces antibodies. No exception on Earth. No AIDS patient on Earth. Catch on? That's the important rule. So I called it an unconventional virus.
And in 1976, Carlton finally won the Nobel Prize for his discovery of what he called an unconventional virus. But he wasn't the only one hungry for a Nobel Prize.
I didn't think these particles were viruses. I didn't think they were slow viruses. I didn't think they were unconventional viruses. I thought they were different.
Bullshit. It's a virus.
However, biochemist Stanley Prusner disagreed and gave Carlton's virus a name, identifying it as a protein particle he called a prion, starting one of the most bitter rivalries in science.
Stan says, it's not a virus, it's a prion. That's not a discovery, that's a word.
And you have to realize that this was the first new pathogen in 100 years, that we knew about viruses and bacteria and parasites and fungi for 100 years. So there was not a lot of I should say, happiness associated with the introduction of this term on the part of a lot of scientists. They were really quite antagonistic.
Prusner would have to wait another 20 years to win his Nobel Prize. His findings turning the world of science upside down.
Prions cannot be classed as living organisms because they contain no DNA or RNA. And therefore, how can they reproduce? And if they're not organisms, how can they cause disease?
Prions ignore the rules of normal biological reproduction. They recruit rather than reproduce, targeting normal proteins and converting them into replicates of themselves. These in turn attack and convert more, building ever-increasing numbers that kill cells in the brain.
So now we had an entirely new disease paradigm that evolved out of these basic studies and the discovery of the prion protein.
Whilst two of the world's top scientists squabbled over what to call the infecting agent, Michael was back in Papua New Guinea, where large numbers of foray adults and adolescents were continuing to die, even 15 years after they had stopped eating their dead.
Other people were forgetting about Kuru. Kuru is something that had done its work, as it were, and could be forgotten about. But that wasn't true for me. We had to continue with the epidemiological surveillance to follow the epidemic, to find out, in fact, how long it will go, to establish the possible length of the incubation period in a human prion disease.
The determined Australian decided to remain in Papua New Guinea to record every case of the disease. But just how long could these extraordinary incubation periods extend? And for how many years would Michael have to track the Kuru epidemic? In 1984, 25 years after the cessation of cannibalism, close to 30 adults were still dying of Kuru every year. Incubation periods were reaching lengths way beyond what Michael had ever imagined as possible.
I had no idea how long the epidemic would continue. In the literature, there's the statement that we have to continue for another decade. And every decade we kept saying that.
Fear has quickly spread through Europe. And then, in 1985, a modern cannibal practice hit headlines around the world.
Sending shockwaves through an industry worth some 50.
Then came BSE, mad cow disease. Was clearly in the same group of diseases as Kuru, Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, scrapie. And of course, the analogy with Kuru and the consumption of the dead was immediate, because of this practice of feeding calves meat and bone meal, which derived from brain material and spinal cord at the abattoirs. And that we know with Kuru that they are the infectious parts of the body. And the big question, of course, was it transmissible to humans?
And it was 10 years after it first surfaced in Britain that mad cow disease was found to have crossed over to the human population. Called variant CJD, there have been over 150 cases in the UK since 1995 from eating infected beef.
A large majority of the UK population has potentially been exposed to BSE. We don't know what the infectious dose or the lethal dose that you need to be exposed to develop the disease is. We don't know what lies ahead. We don't know how many people are actually silently harbouring the infection.
Professor John Collins spearheads the research into variant CJD in the UK. One of the first people he contacted for help was Michael Alpers in Papua New Guinea, where remarkably he was still finding 1 or 2 Kuru cases every year.
The natural thing to do was to turn to the only other known human epidemic of prion diseases, which was Kuru. Long Kuru na imi come down na mi pelama mas Londispilla. There's a me work yet Londispilla, long Australia. John Collins work yet long England.
Kuru's been of immense interest to everyone working in the prawn field for many years. It's of enormous historical interest, particularly about the range of incubation periods. We're particularly interested in what the upper limit of that might be.
we have documentation on every case of Kuru that's occurred. So it's the full record of a disease. And we knew that in some cases, Kuru could have an incredibly long incubation period of over 50 years.
Michael's work is now providing the foundations for predicting the outcome of variant CJD in the UK. But the fact that this was transmitted from cows to humans means incubation periods could be even longer.
When you crossed a species barrier in transmission, you tended to double the incubation period.
So this means that there's a real possibility of incubation periods in variant Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease of up to 100 years, beyond the normal human lifespan. And that's a big worry from the public health point of view.
Because Kuru, BSE in cattle, that's a disease of the brain.
Variant CJD is not just a disease of the brain, it's a disease of the lymph organs. It's in the spleen, in the tonsils, in the gut, and in the blood. And this means that there is a risk that the disease could be unknowingly transmitted by blood transfusion or organ transplants. And indeed, there already has been transmission from human to human through blood.
Scientific research now focused on genetic studies, trying to determine why some people contracted the disease earlier than others.
The work now is on looking at the genetics of the families and the populations that Kuru has affected. Is there anything different about the people who have gone down with Kuru early to those that go down late? Is there anything different about the people who don't get Kuru, even though they might have been present at the feasting where the prion was?
The genetic research has shown that the majority of humans are likely to have longer incubation periods. And although the number of variant CJD cases peaked in the UK in 2000, with only a handful of cases throughout the rest of the world, Michael now believes there could be a much larger wave of the epidemic for decades to follow.
The first 200 cases of variant CJD were all of the kind, genetically, that have short incubation periods. And so we predicted from our knowledge of Kuru that another wave of the epidemic may come, which would be much broader and longer, and that new wave has probably just begun.
But the genetic studies have also revealed a spectacular discovery about all our ancient ancestors.
There are certain genetic patterns that are found in the foray, and they clearly relate to the presence of Kuru. And looking in other human populations, sophisticated genetic studies were done, and the expectation was that Kuru and the foray would be one pattern, and the rest of the world would be the contrasting pattern. But no, it turned out that these detailed studies suggested that in the remote human past, the same practices occurred. Cannibalism and such practices were universal.
In other words, we could all be descended from ancient cultures which practiced the eating of their dead. But even in more recent history, cannibalism in its various forms was more widespread than we commonly accept.
I think there's very, very important social aspects that have come out of the research here that need to be remembered, and that is the consumption of human flesh is just not unique to this particular area. It was a very common practice in the British Navy in the 17th century. The recollections of the roasting of the long pig, or you see the shipwrecked sailor sort of stories.
People in England attended hangings to get the fresh blood to drink in the 17th and 18th centuries in England. You know, so we were cannibals ourselves. It's our suppression of it in ourselves that's given us this attitude about other people. We think that we're so civilized and other people are not.
This isn't some strange practice by a primitive people in PNG. This is a fairly common social practice, but a millennia ago we might have seen similar practices all around the world.
Michael has devoted 50 years of his life to helping the foray, and today they're putting on a public feast to honor him. To the foray, he is family.
Right from the beginning, there was this bond of common humanity. And this is something you don't get from reading the anthropological literature. You always get the feeling that these people are so different that you can never really connect. But the connection came almost immediately. That was an extraordinary experience.
And for Michael, it's a relationship he hopes will one day finally emerge from the shadow of Kuru.
Kuru has always been central to my life from the moment I started on, and it's still there. We haven't snipped that thread yet, and I hope, I've hoped now for some time, that I will be able to be around when we can say we've seen the last case of Kuru.
Voilà, Patitifa touche à sa fin. Je vous donne rendez-vous la semaine prochaine pour un nouveau numéro. Quant à moi, je vous souhaite de passer une excellente soirée sur Polynésie Première. Tiaro Fayarhei, Parheyan 1 et Yorana.